Welcome back, everybody. It's that time again to share a little bit of the wisdom, so let's get right to it. Could you talk about amps? I'm on the look for one and would like your opinion. I was thinking of Vox or Fender, maybe something clean sounding. Yeah, so amps, where to begin? I think it kind of needs a little bit of context to really make a solid recommendation of what amp you should get or what amps you should try out. Like, are you looking for something small that you want to keep in a house that you can record with? Do you want something you can gig with? What kind of styles of music do you play? Stuff like that. But if we want to keep it to kind of what he's talking about, like a good, clean sounding amp that is in kind of like a moderate price range, there's a few ones that you should definitely check out. And the first question you have to ask yourself is, you want something solid state or something that's a tube amp? And generally, I think the consensus among guitar players are that tube amps sound better, and I would agree with that. They have a more of just like a professional sound, and the sound that you get from a tube warming up just gives you a better sound than you can get with solid state. Solid state is coming a long way, and some solid state amps sound awesome, right? But if you're starting out, like if you're kind of in the beginner phase, I definitely think solid state is a good way to go because you get so many more options, like a headphone jack, right? If you want to practice quietly, you can't get a headphone jack on a tube amp. It has to be a solid state amp, right? And also, too, a lot of the solid state amps, there's a bunch of effects built in. A lot of them nowadays you can use as like Bluetooth speakers, stuff like that. But I kind of wanted to talk about some of my personal favorites of tube amps that are moderately priced, right? And I think he was right on when he said maybe like a Fender or a Vox for like a clean sound. And I think those are two manufacturers to definitely start with because they both have great clean sounds and they're both kind of like a distinct signature clean sound. Like if you've ever heard somebody talk about like a British sounding amp, they're probably talking about like a Vox style amp, and an American sounding amp is probably more of like a Fender thing. So I've personally owned quite a few different Voxes and Fenders throughout the day. And I think the Fender Blues Junior is probably one of the most popular intro moderately priced tube amps. And I've had a Blues Junior for a long time, and it's a really great amp, and it sounds awesome without any pedals or anything like that. But I personally think the best sounding one in that price range, we're talking like maybe $400 to $600, something like that, is the AC15 C1. Now, I actually don't have an AC15. I have an AC30, and it's great for gigging and stuff like that too, but the AC30 is like super heavy. It gets crazy loud, and I think you can really get a little bit more out of an AC15 for most situations. The 15 means it's 15 watts. And to me, an AC15 is a little more versatile than some of the Fender ones in the same price range. Now, another question you should probably ask yourself is, do you want something to plug in clean and have that be your sound, or if you want to have like a bunch of pedals in front of it? Because another one that people really like is the Fender Hot Rod Deluxe. I personally prefer the Blues Junior to the Hot Rod Deluxe. I'm not a huge fan of the Hot Rod Deluxe just plugging straight into it, but it takes pedals really well, and it's actually like a pretty lightweight amp that is super giggable. So a lot of people like the Hot Rod Deluxe because it takes pedals well, there's a ton of headroom, and it does have like a really great Fender clean sound. But for me personally, I kind of like the Blues Junior better. The best clean sounding amp I've ever heard, ever played through, is a Fender Princeton Reverb 65. Now they've got a couple different models of it, but the one that's like $1,000, which is kind of pricey, to me that was like the best, most accurate representation of how I feel like a really superb Fender clean sounds. So if you ever get a chance to play a Fender Princeton, I'm sure I'll have one at some point. But right now I actually have a Mesa 525 Express head as my main amp, just because I've been doing like a lot of high gain stuff. And I think the clean sounding there sounds a little bit more like the Fender cleans go. I mean, it's really tweakable, stuff like that too. A lot of people nowadays are doing heads because they're more versatile. You don't always have to use like a physical cabinet. Now they have like these like Torpedo Life Studio things where they have cab simulators that you can plug the head of the amp right into the simulator, so you're not getting like a lot of volume and stuff like that. I really haven't had a lot of experience with the amp sims. I just kind of like using heads and cabs for the most part. But yeah, my recommendation is to play a Fender Princeton if you can get your hands on one, and AC15 you really can't go wrong. Even if you kind of use the gain, you get a lot of usable rock tones without having to use any pedals for the 15, which to me, I can't really say that about like a Blues Junior or like a Hot Rod Deluxe. While we're talking about amps, I do want to quickly touch on the immortal Line 6 Spyder 4. I feel like I'm always seeing people just like ripping on this amp on the internet, on YouTube, everywhere. It's a $100 amp. You know, it's not super loud. It doesn't sound great, but for $100, like, you can't beat it. It's like a pretty awesome amp for $100. Like, there's so many like videos out there like talking about how it's like the biggest piece of crap, stuff like that. I've had a ton of students who own this amp. It works. It turns on every time. It gives you different options. You can plug an MP3 in. For $100, you really can't complain too much. And I think it's really kind of the best in class of the other $100 amps. So even like the Fender Mustang ones are a little bit more than that. And, you know, they're comparable. Like, again, you all have to take it with a grain of salt because you're not really going to make an awesome rock album using just a $100 amp. But if it's just something that you want to practice, you're just like starting guitar or something like that, Line 6, Spyder, $100, whatever, go for it. I'll be the only one on YouTube defending the Line 6 Spyder. Besides Johnny Greenwood, who are some of your other favorite guitarists? Yeah, so there's like a ton of guitarists that I just love. And my personal story is I didn't really start playing guitar until I was 17, which is kind of late for some people, but I mean, whatever. And the person that got me into guitar in general was Hendrix. So I was a huge Hendrix fan. I really heard him for the first time at 17, because I think like me and all my friends like back in the day really just listened to hip hop up until that time. So I didn't really get like a lot of guitar inspiration listening to some of the hip hop stuff back then. But once I heard Hendrix, I was like super hooked. I got an electric guitar that weekend, and the first songs I started to learn to play were Hendrix songs, which is like incredibly difficult for someone who like totally sucks as a beginner, but it was like a really rewarding experience for me to have done it that way, I think. So I still listen to Jimi Hendrix a lot. I went from there directly into my Led Zeppelin phase that pretty much everybody has. So I'm still a huge Jimmy Page fan. I kind of think my favorite guitarist is still the guitarist that I really got into early. I think after going through my Hendrix and Zeppelin phase, I got really, really into Elliott Smith. And if you don't know Elliott Smith, he has like the most cultish fan support ever. I personally think he's the best acoustic guitar player in just the history of music. His compositions are so good. You can learn guitar melody, chords, everything just by listening to different Elliott Smith songs. So Elliott Smith is another big one. Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead is a big one. I love Matt Bellamy from Muse. I think he's an awesome guy. And Josh Homme from Queens of the Stone Age is another big inspiration of mine. I never personally got really into like the shreddy guys. I mean, I have like a huge amount of respect for guys like Petrucci and Vai and Malmsteen and stuff like that. But I just, for my own personal taste, I'm kind of more into the songwriting and kind of the creative ways to use guitar as a songwriting device instead of just the amazing shredders that those guys are. And I'm not taking anything away from them. Lord knows I could never do half the stuff that they just do routinely. But yeah, those are some of my favorite guitar players. Could you maybe make a video explaining arpeggios, but with a bit more detail? I've watched the one you already have, but it's been hard for me to understand it. Or maybe you could just give some tips on it. Thanks. In my opinion, arpeggios are probably the most misrepresented tools of really unlocking the entire fretboard on a guitar. Like the definition of an arpeggio is just playing a chord one note at a time. And a lot of times, you'll go forward, you'll ascend through the chord, and descend. So for example, if we just have like an A minor chord, you probably know that chord right there. An arpeggio, you might think, would be like this. I'm just playing the A string, D string, G string, B string, and going up and down. And you kind of get this lullaby type sounding thing, which is cool. But I remember when I first learned it, I was very dismissive of that because it's like, I don't really dig that kind of sound. So I just dismissed arpeggios entirely. It wasn't until later when I actually realized that arpeggios are much more valuable than that. And I think they get their value from learning them from a scale shape instead of a chord shape, right? So let's take the A minor scale shape like this, right? And if you watch the chord videos, then you know that we just take the 1, 3, and 5 from that to get a chord out of that, an A minor chord. We have an A, a C, and an E, right? So instead of a chord, we have the notes that make the chord, right? And then we can repeat that up another octave. So if we stay in this one hand shape, we'd have the A, C, E, A, C, E, right? Now, what I think is even more valuable than that is taking it through different positions. So kind of moving through the guitar neck. So you take that first shape, and if you think, the interval here, this minor third, is 3 frets on the same string. Then you go to the next string down. Then you start again, right, on the octave, right? So when you get to the octave, you can think of just going down 3 frets and then down a string and back a fret. So I'm gonna get to the octave and do the same thing, right? So what I did here, I started this is my first note, and I remembered that interval, and I just slid into it down the neck, right? So I'm sliding through to the minor third instead of reaching. I'm sliding into it. So all of a sudden I have, and that's, I think, a better way to approach arpeggios. And then the more you know about different chords, the more you can kind of do different things with it. You can add notes to that. We could add like the 7th note, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you have a 1, 3, 5, 7, and then into the 1, 3, 5, 7, right? And then once you start learning a couple different shapes, it becomes a lot more valuable, because when you just go up and down a chord shape, try to move that to another chord. That's not what I'm looking for, because the open strings aren't coming with you. So if you make a self-contained kind of a line, as they call it in some guitar circles, there's the A minor. I can do a G minor one just as easily, just start on a G. So I really think that they're more valuable to see as moving through chords, and I might do a longer form video on arpeggios, but I think just some tips are just take a scale, and even if you don't have a particular chord in mind, right? Maybe just start adding certain notes to it. Maybe you don't want that minor third in there. Maybe you want something a little different, just kind of like a 1, a 2, and a 5, right? They're just different ways to kind of fluidly move throughout, and then just start mixing and matching, adding other notes. You're really going to develop a better sense of where the notes are if you kind of use them in arpeggios and start moving them through the fretboard. So listening homework this week, I want you to check out a band called Hiatus Kaiyote. Now, they're kind of like a neo-funk future space soul band, which isn't really my first genre, but these guys are awesome. They're kind of blowing up a little bit now. They released an album last year, Choose Your Weapon, which is fantastic. For what it is, I think it's just like the best ever. And what I want you to listen to is the lead singer is also the guitar player. She's a nasty guitar player, but she really does a great job of using guitar as a lead instrument in the context of a band. So there's only 4 members in this band, but yet they still get like a huge sound with a lot of different separation. And I think it's because all the musicians do a great job of not really stepping on each other and not really showcasing one instrument at maybe like the detriment to the song. So I'm going to link to a couple ones. The first one, The Lung, is just like an awesome repetitive guitar line that to me just never gets boring. And then the next one is just a good example of kind of like how she meshes into the band without ever really taking front stage, which I think guitar players in general might have a tendency to kind of steal a little bit of the shine from the band for just like a pass or two or whatever. But this is just such a super tight band that they all kind of know their role and they stay within it throughout the duration. I recommend any of their albums, and they just did kind of like a remix thing. You should definitely check that out and let me know what you think. As always, thanks for all the questions and comments. Feel free to send them to me. Keep them coming, and I'll keep making more videos. Thanks a lot.